Most people think Myanmar is just poor because it's underdeveloped or mismanaged. But the shocking truth, this country should be one of the richest in Asia. It has fertile land that could feed millions, jade and precious stones worth billions, gas pipelines connecting it to China, basically a lottery ticket that hit all the right numbers. And yet, it's collapsing. Generations have seen wealth squandered, cities stagnate, and hope vanish. How did a country with everything it needed to thrive end up on the brink? In this video, we'll uncover why Myanmar had all the tools to become rich, how power, isolation, and war destroyed its potential, a brief window where it almost escaped collapse, and how it slammed shut. By the end, you'll see that Myanmar's story isn't just about poverty, it's about choices, power, and a series of shocking missteps that kept a rich country poor. Myanmar's story starts with a simple, almost unbelievable fact. It had everything. Not some of it, not most of it, everything a country needs to get rich. Its geographic position alone reads like a cheat code for success. Sandwiched between India and China with easy access to Southeast Asia, Myanmar sits at the crossroads of trade, culture, and commerce. It's the kind of location that would have made it the region's hub for centuries if history had gone differently. Then there is the natural wealth. Myanmar's soil is fertile enough to feed a growing population multiple times over. Its rivers, the Irrawaddy, the Salween, the Chinwan, provide irrigation, transport, and the lifeblood of agriculture. Under the surface, the country hides treasures that would make many nations salivate: jade, rubies, precious timber, and vast natural gas reserves. For decades, these resources could have been a springboard into industrialization, energy production, and export-driven growth. Add a long coastline with direct access to the Indian Ocean and you have a country perfectly positioned to dominate regional trade. But here's the part that shocks most people. Myanmar wasn't always behind its neighbors. In the mid-20th century, before decades of military rule and isolation, it was actually richer than Thailand and even South Korea. Imagine that, a country that could have been the envy of Asia, sitting on untapped wealth with ports, rivers, and fertile valleys ready to turn prosperity into growth, and yet, somehow, it didn't happen. Looking at Myanmar in this light, failure seems almost unnatural. Countries without resources or strategic position often struggle. Countries like South Korea had to import nearly everything to survive. But Myanmar had all the ingredients: geography, resources, population, and natural infrastructure. Its rivers could connect cities, its ports could connect trade, its land could feed nations, and yet, somehow, it became the opposite of what it could have been, a place defined by scarcity, stagnation, and missed opportunity. This is why the story of Myanmar is so compelling. When you look at a map, you might see a poor, sparsely populated country, but when you peel back the layers, you see the illusion of failure. There was nothing inevitable about its collapse. The country had a winning hand, a lottery ticket with all the numbers, and the question is not why it failed, but how it could have let it slip through its fingers. Myanmar's poverty and instability weren't caused by bad luck. They were the result of a series of choices, political, economic, and social, that would soon transform this rich, promising nation into a cautionary tale. In 1962, Myanmar made a choice that would echo for decades. The military seized power. What followed wasn't just a change in government, it was a complete transformation of the country's economic DNA. The army didn't just rule Myanmar, it became the economy itself. The coup marked the start of permanent military dominance, and the effects were immediate and catastrophic. The generals didn't just impose laws, they nationalized the entire private sector. Businesses, farms, factories all became tools of the state. Entrepreneurs who had once dared to dream of growth found themselves powerless. Investment dried up overnight. Innovation slowed to a crawl, and the feedback loops that normally reward risk and talent in a functioning economy were shattered. The generals didn't stop at controlling the economy, they inserted themselves as business owners. Luxury hotels, import-export firms, construction companies, every comfortable corner of the country had a uniformed officer at the top. This wasn't governance, it was predation dressed as administration. Real markets where supply meets demand and competition drives efficiency were replaced by crony capitalism, where loyalty to the military mattered more than skill or productivity. Isolation compounded the problem. Fear became the new currency. Citizens unsure of the rules or afraid of punishment stopped taking initiative. Foreign investors were kept at bay, wary of a system where contracts meant little and bribes meant everything. Institutions that could have ensured accountability, courts, regulatory bodies, civil service, were hollowed out. Myanmar became a country where trust had no place and where the natural incentives that drive growth were suffocating. The consequences were more than economic, they were structural. When power and wealth are concentrated in the hands of a few, the economy stops being a living system. It stops rewarding competence and starts rewarding obedience. Farms sit idle, factories underperform, and capital flees the moment it can. Opportunities that should have turned Myanmar into an Asian powerhouse were systematically ignored or hijacked by generals more interested in personal gain than national progress. By the 1980s, this pattern was clear. Myanmar was not merely poor, it was trapped in a self-perpetuating cycle of stagnation. The military's grip on the economy created a paradox, a country rich in resources and potential, yet poor in results. Citizens worked, produced, and hoped, only to see their labor siphoned into government-controlled channels that rewarded loyalty, not efficiency. Innovation became a dangerous gamble, risk was punished, and growth, it became a distant memory. When the state becomes the sole arbiter of wealth and opportunity, the incentives that drive progress vanish. Investment stops, ideas die, institutions crumble, and a nation that should have been rich slowly becomes a cautionary tale of what happens when power devours possibility. It's easy to blame sanctions for Myanmar's poverty. After all, for decades, Western nations restricted trade, investment, and aid, punishing the military regime for its abuses. But here's the twist. Sanctions weren't the main reasons Myanmar failed. The real disaster came from something far more silent and far more devastating: isolation. While neighboring countries were plugging into the global economy, Myanmar was missing from the table. Vietnam, China, and later Bangladesh were riding the wave of industrialization, setting up factories, connecting to supply chains, and learning modern business practices. Myanmar, it was cut off. No integration into global trade meant no access to technology, no foreign capital, and no knowledge exchange. The world was moving, innovating, and growing, and Myanmar wasn't there to learn. The results were catastrophic. By the 1980s and 1990s, the manufacturing boom had created millions of jobs across Asia, lifted entire populations out of poverty, and transformed countries into export powerhouses. Myanmar could have done the same. It had cheap labor, fertile land, and a strategic location near booming markets. Instead, decades of isolation meant it missed the most critical window of global opportunity. Isolation didn't just stall growth, it drained talent. Young, ambitious professionals left for Thailand, Singapore, and beyond, seeking education, jobs, and opportunity. This brain drain left Myanmar with a shrinking pool of innovators, entrepreneurs, and skilled workers. Those who remained faced an economy locked in raw exports, timber, gas, jade, or informal smuggling networks. Innovation stagnated and the economy became a collection of extractive activities rather than productive ones. Even more striking is how Myanmar's isolation created a vicious cycle. Without participation in global trade, domestic industries couldn't compete. Without competition, there was no pressure to modernize. Without modernization, there were no jobs worth keeping talent at home. The country was absent when the world was writing the rules of modern economic success, and by the time Myanmar could have caught up, its neighbors were already decades ahead. Sanctions may have hurt, but they were only a side note. The damage wasn't punishment from outsiders, it was self-inflicted absence. By refusing or failing to integrate into global systems, Myanmar cut itself off from the very lessons and opportunities that turn resources into prosperity. A country that could have industrialized and exported value-added goods remained trapped, exporting raw materials at bargain prices while the world learned, grew, and innovated around it. Isolation also normalized stagnation. It reinforced fear, mistrust, and dependence on the military. Instead of learning from global markets, domestic enterprises learned to survive under state control, often illegally, often informally. And when opportunities did arise, a chance to attract foreign investment, a chance to modernize the institutions and culture weren't ready. The country was structurally behind, and every year of absence compounded the gap. In short, Myanmar's poverty wasn't imposed from outside, it was engineered by absence, by decades of missing out, and by a failure to connect when the world was moving fastest. The tragedy is that the lottery ticket was still in its hand. The resources, location, and people were all there, but the country wasn't playing the game. Even a country with wealth, location, and human capital can fail if it's at war with itself. And in Myanmar, that war has been ongoing for decades. Dozens of ethnic armed groups operate across the country, from the hills of Kachin in the north to the jungles of Karen in the southeast. For generations, these groups have resisted central control, fought for autonomy, and sometimes simply fought to survive. The result is a fractured state. Large swaths of Myanmar, especially along the borders, remain effectively outside government control. These regions are rich in resources, jade, timber, and minerals, yet they are economically disconnected from the rest of the country. Instead of fueling development, these resources often fund armed groups, perpetuating cycles of conflict. Wealth that could build schools, hospitals, and factories instead buys weapons and sustains militias. Infrastructure, a critical pillar of economic growth, is nearly impossible in conflict zones. Roads crumble, bridges remain unbuilt, and electricity grids stop at invisible front lines. Even when the central government attempts to invest, projects are slow, dangerous, and expensive. Farmers cannot reliably transport goods to markets, factories cannot reliably receive materials, and trade corridors cannot function without security. Potential remains trapped by instability. Investors, both domestic and foreign, are painfully aware of this reality. For them, unpredictability is worse than poverty. A country might be poor but stable, like Laos, and attract long-term investment. But a country like Myanmar, where control over land and production can change overnight, is a financial minefield. Capital stays away, and any businesses that attempt to operate are forced to navigate corruption, extortion, or armed threats. Growth requires not just resources, but predictability, and Myanmar consistently fails that basic test. This fragmentation also reinforces inequality. Ethnic areas, despite their natural wealth, remain underdeveloped. Cities like Yangon or Mandalay may see pockets of growth, but the country as a whole cannot leverage its full potential. Conflict becomes both cause and effect. Without investment, poverty persists. Without resolution, conflict continues. Myanmar is trapped in a vicious cycle where internal divisions prevent the economic compounding that builds wealth over time. Perhaps the most striking irony is that the very resources that should have lifted Myanmar to prosperity, jade, timber, gas, fertile farmland, instead fund the war that keeps the country poor. A country that should have been rich is structurally prevented from turning its assets into opportunity. The lessons of development in Asia are clear. Peace and stability are prerequisites for sustained growth. Myanmar had the resources, the location, and the population, but it lacked the unity to use them. By this point in its history, it becomes obvious. Myanmar's collapse isn't just about corruption or bad governance. It's about a country fragmented into competing fiefdoms where the natural mechanisms of growth, investment, infrastructure, trade are constantly undermined by conflict. Even wealth in a nation divided becomes economically useless. For nearly 50 years, Myanmar seemed destined to lag behind. The military's grip, isolation, and internal conflict had kept the country in a state of stagnation. Yet, between 2011 and 2020, something remarkable happened. For the first time in decades, Myanmar seemed to be catching up. A window opened, and it looked like the country might finally turn its long squandered potential into tangible growth. The change began with partial liberalization. The government loosened some of its tight controls over the economy, allowed limited foreign investment, and opened the door, just a crack, to global markets. Investors took notice. Garment factories began sprouting in Yangon and Mandalay, connecting Myanmar to global supply chains in textiles. Tourism, long dormant under isolation, surged as visitors flocked to ancient temples, pristine beaches, and untapped landscapes. Suddenly, there was optimism. Streets buzzed with small businesses, foreign capital trickled in, and for the first time, the phrase "Myanmar might succeed" could be said without irony. But the window wasn't wide enough, and it wasn't backed by substance. The reforms were superficial, not structural. Institutions remained weak, courts had no independence, regulatory systems were inconsistent, civil service was still dominated by military loyalists. Investors could enter, but the rules of the game were unclear, contracts were unreliable, and legal protections were minimal. Essentially, the country had the appearance of opportunity without the foundation to sustain it. Still, for almost a decade, hope persisted. Myanmar's GDP grew, foreign investment flowed, and the world began to see it as a rising star of Southeast Asia. The paradox was painfully obvious. Here was a country that could finally turn potential into progress, proving that its failures were not inevitable. It could have joined the ranks of Vietnam, Thailand, or even Cambodia in regional growth, creating jobs, infrastructure, and a new generation of wealth. Then, in 2021, everything unraveled. The military, which had formally ceded some power, staged another coup. The fragile trust that had been building evaporated overnight. Investors fled. Foreign capital, which had cautiously entered during the liberalization window, left faster than it had arrived. Factories closed, banks froze operations, tourism disappeared as the world recoiled from instability. The optimism that had briefly lifted the nation was replaced by fear, uncertainty, and despair. What makes this collapse so painful is not just the return of authoritarianism, it's the fact that Myanmar proved it could almost succeed, only to erase all of it in a single act. For 10 years, the country flirted with prosperity and the world began to take notice. But the institutions that were never built, the power structures that were never reformed, and the military that refused to relinquish control ensured that progress could not stick. Myanmar's brief experiment in growth became a mirror showing the nation what it could have been, making the failure even more bitter. By the end of this decade-long window, the lesson is undeniable. Myanmar's story is not one of permanent inevitability, it is one of squandered potential. It's a nation rich in resources, location, and talent that demonstrated the possibility of success, then destroyed it with its own hands. The country that could have risen as an Asian powerhouse now faces the tragic reality that near success can be more painful than never trying at all. Myanmar didn't just fail once. It teased the world with hope only to slam the door shut on its own future. And that is the cruelest twist of all. Myanmar's story is a lesson in contrasts. It is a land that should have been rich, a country with fertile soil, abundant resources, and a strategic location at the heart of Asia, and yet, time and again, it has squandered its own potential. The military didn't just govern, it replaced the economy. Isolation robbed the nation of the lessons and opportunities that neighboring countries seized. Ethnic conflicts and internal fractures made wealth almost impossible to turn into progress. And even when Myanmar glimpsed hope during the 2011 to 2020 window, it was snatched away in an instant, leaving the nation back at square one. This is the tragic truth. Myanmar didn't fail because it lacked tools, talent, or resources. It failed because power, conflict, and poor governance repeatedly dismantled the structures needed for growth. It is a cautionary tale that reminds the world how fragile potential can be and how quickly promise can turn into despair when the wrong forces hold control. Yet, the story is not just about loss, it's also about possibility. Myanmar has everything it needs to thrive. The lottery ticket is still in its hand. The question is whether it will ever find the leadership, stability, and institutions to turn that ticket into wealth and opportunity for its people. For now, Myanmar remains a country of what could have been, a powerful reminder that being rich in resources doesn't guarantee prosperity, and that true wealth comes from trust, institutions, and peace as much as from soil, minerals, or location. Thanks for watching, mate, and a bundle of thanks for hitting the subscribe button.